America just spent $2 trillion to lose the chip war it started. While politicians celebrated the CHIPS Act as a masterpiece of strategic thinking, our own export controls handed China exactly what it needed to build the world's most advanced semiconductor industry. Tonight, we're diving into the numbers that reveal how America's chip war didn't just fail, it backfired so spectacularly that we may have accidentally created our biggest technological rival. The numbers are staggering, and they tell a story Washington doesn't want you to hear. Over the past 3 years, America's semiconductor industry has watched $2 trillion in market value simply vanish, not from natural market forces or technological disruption, but from our own government's trade policies. This isn't just another story about political miscalculation. This is about how the United States accidentally turbocharged China's rise to semiconductor supremacy while crippling our own industry in the process. Let's start with what actually happened. In 2022, the Biden administration launched what they called the most comprehensive semiconductor export control regime in history. The goal was simple: prevent China from accessing advanced chip technology and force them to rely on American suppliers forever. The CHIPS Act followed with $52 billion in subsidies, promising to rebuild America's manufacturing dominance. Politicians from both parties celebrated these moves as strategic masterstrokes that would secure American technological leadership for decades. The reality has been exactly the opposite. Within 18 months of these policies taking effect, something remarkable happened in China. Companies that had relied on American chips for decades suddenly found themselves cut off from their suppliers. Instead of collapsing, they did something Washington never anticipated. They innovated faster than ever before. Huawei, supposedly crippled by sanctions, shocked the world in 2023 by releasing a smartphone with a domestically produced 7-nanometer chip. This wasn't supposed to be possible according to export control logic, yet there it was in consumers' hands. But Huawei's breakthrough was just the beginning. Across China's tech sector, export controls created what economists call forced innovation. When you can't buy the technology you need, you have no choice but to develop it yourself.
Chinese semiconductor companies, backed by massive state investment and protected from American competition by our own trade barriers, began closing the technology gap at unprecedented speed. Today, Chinese firms are producing chips that compete directly with NVIDIA's high-end offerings, selling them at significantly lower prices to global customers who are increasingly reluctant to depend on American suppliers. The financial devastation in American markets tells the story in stark numbers. During a single trading session in July 2024, chip stocks lost over $500 billion in value as investors realized that export controls were destroying rather than protecting American market position. But that was just the beginning of the sell-off. Over the following 3 months, semiconductor companies watched their market capitalization shrink by nearly $2 trillion as the reality of strategic miscalculation became impossible to ignore. These aren't just abstract numbers, they represent real jobs and real companies. Intel, the company that received the largest CHIPS Act subsidy package, announced layoffs of over 15,000 workers despite getting $8.5 billion in government funding. The company that lobbied Congress by promising to create millions of American jobs instead became a symbol of how industrial policy can prop up failing businesses rather than foster genuine competitiveness. Other major semiconductor firms reported similar workforce reductions, with the industry losing over 2,000 science and engineering positions annually, precisely the high-skilled jobs these policies were supposed to protect. The talent exodus has been particularly damaging because innovation in semiconductors depends on global collaboration. The industry thrives when the brightest minds from different countries can work together, sharing insights from materials science, quantum physics, and advanced manufacturing. American export controls didn't just restrict technology transfers, they restricted the flow of knowledge itself. International researchers became reluctant to collaborate with American institutions, fearing that their work might become subject to sudden policy changes. Graduate students from other countries, who historically filled crucial roles in American semiconductor research, began choosing universities in Europe and Asia instead.
Meanwhile, China was solving the exact problem that American policies were supposed to create.
Export controls forced Chinese companies to develop their own supply chains, their own manufacturing processes, and their own research networks. What might have taken decades of gradual market development was compressed into just a few years of intensive, state-backed innovation. Chinese semiconductor companies now produce twice as many research papers as American firms on chip design and production. They're investing heavily in alternative approaches to chip performance, like advanced packaging and chiplet technologies that may allow them to leapfrog traditional manufacturing advantages. The irony is particularly stark when you look at what China has accomplished in mature process nodes. While American companies focused on cutting-edge technology that serves primarily military and high-performance computing applications, Chinese firms aggressively expanded capacity in the chips that actually power most consumer electronics. These are the semiconductors that go into smartphones, automobiles, household appliances, and industrial equipment, the massive volume markets that generate most industry revenue. SMIC, China's largest foundry, recently announced a 40% price cut for its 28-nanometer process, potentially creating global dependencies in segments that don't require the most advanced technology. This shift in manufacturing capacity has profound implications for American industry. Companies that depend on semiconductors for their products, which is essentially every manufacturer in the modern economy, now face a choice between expensive domestic chips and cheaper Chinese alternatives. Export controls meant to protect American semiconductor firms have instead made American manufacturing less competitive in global markets. The restrictions created exactly the outcome they were designed to prevent: reduced American influence over global technology supply chains. The geopolitical consequences extend far beyond economics. By weaponizing semiconductor exports, America set a precedent that other countries are already using against American interests. China now controls critical materials like gallium and germanium that American semiconductor manufacturers need for production. Beijing has imposed its own export controls on these materials, creating new vulnerabilities that didn't exist before the trade war began. Other countries are drawing similar lessons about the risks of depending on American technology and financial systems, accelerating the development of alternative networks that exclude rather than include American companies.
European allies have been particularly reluctant to fully implement American export controls, fearing the loss of access to Chinese markets and the precedent of unilateral trade restrictions. This creates enforcement gaps that undermine policy effectiveness while damaging alliance relationships that took decades to build. When America acts unilaterally in global technology markets, it forces other countries to choose between American demands and their own economic interests, a choice that increasingly doesn't favor American positions. Perhaps most importantly, these policies fundamentally misunderstood how innovation actually works in the semiconductor industry. Chips don't get better because governments mandate improvement. They advance through competitive pressure, collaborative research, and access to global markets. By restricting international collaboration and fragmenting global markets, American policies reduced rather than enhanced the innovation environment that historically drove technological progress. Companies subject to export controls have been forced to divert resources from research and development to compliance and market adaptation, slowing rather than accelerating American technological advancement. The policy reversals under the Trump administration have only added to the chaos. After promising to repeal the CHIPS Act as a ridiculous program, the administration simultaneously takes credit for investments that began under previous policies while implementing new restrictions that contradict earlier approaches. Companies cannot make long-term investment decisions when fundamental rules change with each election cycle, creating regulatory uncertainty that may be more damaging than consistent restrictions.
Looking at the current trajectory, China appears likely to achieve 50% self-sufficiency in semiconductor production by 2030, with the possibility of reaching even higher levels in crucial market segments. This represents exactly the outcome that American chip wars were designed to prevent, achieved through policies that inadvertently provided China with the market protection and political justification needed to accelerate domestic technological development. The question facing American policymakers isn't whether chip war strategies have failed. The $2 trillion in market losses and China's rapid technological advancement make that clear. The question is whether America can learn from these mistakes and develop approaches that actually enhance rather than undermine American technological competitiveness.
The semiconductor industry succeeded historically not because of government direction, but because of entrepreneurial dynamism, international collaboration, and competitive market forces. Returning to these principles, rather than doubling down on failed industrial policy, offers the best path forward for maintaining American innovation leadership and an increasingly multipolar technological landscape. What do you think? Are we watching the end of American technological dominance, or can these policies still be turned around? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let me know what aspects of this story you'd like us to investigate further.